one of the things that I'm doing in my quasi-retirement, I theoretically retired 3 years ago. I didn't do a very good job of it, but I'm now down to 2 days a week in the lab. And one of the things I'm doing on one of my off days is a course in film and theater. And it got me interested in thinking about how we write. I think a lot of times when you pick up the journal, you think that it's written in chronological order. The same way when you go to a movie theater, you have this spurious, a well-crafted film, it all flows from beginning to end. And that's not how it's shot. It's not at all how it's shot. The cost of arranging filming and crews, if you're going to do one thing in this room, you're going to do all the scenes in this room, and then tomorrow we'll go over to scripts or something like that. But it's filmed out of sequence and stitched together. And that's one of the things that I think we need to learn when we write papers. It's rare. I can do it now, to start at the beginning and work my way all the way through the end. But it's a lot easier if you don't do that way. If you instead write the paper from the inside out. So what I'd like to do is to kind of talk strategies about doing that. So, how many first authored papers have people written so far that have been published in a journal? 5 or less? Wait, raise your hand. 10 or less? 15 or less? Okay. I need to tell you about some of the mistakes I've made, many. The first paper I wrote took me 3 years after I had completed the research, after I'd completed the reading. I had everything, it was all up here, and I somehow had the thought that the good paper had to begin with the right epigram. So I was busy doing everything I could to avoid writing the paper, and instead digging out Bartlett's familiar quotations and all these sorts of things, looking for the right way of beginning the paper. I lost 3 years. How much time have any of you wasted writing a paper? What's your worst stories to date?
Probably 5 years.
5? Wow, that's good. You got me great.
And counting.
So, we're filming and you don't have to go into it, but I will reveal my flaws. And the next session we're going to have more informal, no filming, but can you share with the group what was the etiology of the 5-year delay?
I mean, it's a combination of things, but I know a lot of it is a lot of years going kind of back and forth between mentors and researching different ways to approach things and maybe looking at different avenues that I hadn't considered before, and then that would take me down another path, and then deciding that path was a dead end, but then going back and starting off at square one. And probably could have, by when all was said and done, it could have been maybe 6 or 7 different papers that I eventually wrote. So I was constantly writing, but the final product was never submitted. And it took a while for the final product to be submitted.
Well, you raise a couple points. I mean, one is that time in some ways is helpful to us. That even though you're not writing the paper, your brain is marinating, and you are kind of working on it. And so a little bit of marination time is great. 5 years is a little long, but people do it. I think the second point is that you mentioned a mentor and going back and forth. It really helps if you've got a mentor who meets with you regularly. But part of that is your job as well as the mentor's job. We're all busy with our careers no matter what stage. And maybe some of you are on call, and some of you are, you're busy writing lots and lots of grants. I can assure you that your mentor is also very busy in some different ways. And sometimes we don't pester our mentors enough. Now, if you've got a mentor who ducks out on you, that makes it a lot harder. But you need to really be assertive, not aggressive, but assertive. It's, after all, your mentor wants you to do this and to succeed. But if you don't, the mentor will kind of assume, well, I haven't heard from her, she's probably doing fine. One of the things that we're struggling with in the CTRI is how to give feedback to mentors and trying to find out what you want from your mentors. That's another topic. We'll get to that. I think anybody get up to LA and see the La Brea tar pits? Well, you got to do that. Right near the art museum, really center of Los Angeles. Wonderful things. I remember being taken there when I was a little boy and seeing these wonderful sculptures of the little woolly mammoth out there trapped up to his knees in the tar pits and all that. We get stuck in tar pits a lot writing. And one of the most important things that we have to do is to avoid the tar pits or get the heck out of them before we start sinking in too far. And that's what we've tried to describe in here. So lots of times people get hung up on the title of the talk itself. There are two hand-ups there. On the title, don't worry about it. Just put something as if you're going to put a label on a Pentaflex folder. Enough so you can recognize it, and you can worry about the title later. There's some discussion actually about the length of the title, and you know, it's a matter, I suppose, of personal preference. I tend not to like titles that go on and on and on and leave me breathless. But longer titles sometimes are necessary. If you've got a title that's more than 2 lines, really think about it. But again, for the working beginning, just something pithy, a Pentaflex folder sort of title is adequate. So step 1 is come up with some working title and write the methods and results. Do not go to the introduction. Do not go to the discussion. Those are the hardest sections of the paper to write. And I should mention that I'm not talking about a review paper. I'm talking about an empirical paper. Review papers generally don't get the respect they deserve. They are the hardest papers to write. And invariably, we all say, well, start out, mark your territory, write a review paper, and we know how hard that is. It's very hard. The empirical papers will actually write themselves.
Why do you think review papers are harder to write?
I think it has to do with the epistemology of what we expect to see in a paper. You know, scientific papers have been out for 300 years. I mean, reasonable, recognizable structure to a paper. Review papers, what is the logic of a review paper? And again, I'm not disparaging it, but how are they organized? Is it a narrative review? Is it a quantitative review? Is it a meta-analysis? The meta-analysis comes close to empirical papers in structure, and they kind of do move along. But a narrative review is just really tough. Any of you writing narrative reviews right now?
I just finished one.
I'm
I just finished one.
Okay. How long did it take?
Well, actually, I had written it a couple of years ago and then put it down.
Another one.
Just, there was a call for a paper that this fit for, and so like within a month, I kind of finished it and sent it. So maybe a year.
Okay.
A year of writing.
I think they're really tough. And they're tough just to kind of think, well, what do I want to emphasize? And what's important? And what does this literature show? I think this problem of the 5-year delay, the 2-year delay, the 3-year delay, you have to ask yourself the old question about if a tree falls in the forest and no one was there, did it fall? Who knows anything about it? That's what science is. If nobody was there to read your paper, you might as well not have done the research. So how do we get communicating with agility is a real struggle. So with empirical papers, we never really stop to realize there are certainly different traditions and different disciplines and journals for length of papers, but generally the methods section will be 2 or 3 pages in size, and there's a whole ritualistic liturgy in the way the methods are constructed. And again, in this sense of keeping moving, keep dribbling the ball, don't get bogged down. Let yourself go in the methods. You should be able to write the methods in an hour. Leave things blank when you're stuck. Just keep on typing. You're going to start something about, and I'm giving you examples from clinical research. So this study was approved by the UCSD IRB. After completing written informed consent, patients were enrolled in the study. Enrollment began on such and such a date and ended on such and such a date. The study is registered on clinicaltrials.gov as something or other. You should be able to just do that. And you'll feel better when you do that. You get something out of the way, and you'll start getting a rhythm. Chances are you're going to move on to a section about eligibility. And I'm just giving you patter sorts of things. These are the sorts of things that you see all the time in a paper, and you're going to want to put it in your own. And sometimes you're too close to it, you're not sure how to organize it. Use a template. This is workable. Eligible subjects consisted of English-speaking adults who were generally healthy with the exception of XYZ. And then if your paper is about thalassemia, you're going to say thalassemia was diagnosed according to the following criteria. And patients were excluded for the following reasons. These are fine bones of a skeleton, and you can expand it as necessary. I think generally what we look for next in the methods is something about the procedure. And sometimes people get caught up in that. Have any of you gotten stuck on procedure aspects of writing?
In the meta section?
Yeah, in the method. So essentially what you did to people when they were admitted, what time of day did you do a sleep recording? Yes, even a sleep recording in the daytime. You spill these things out. How were questionnaires administered? How were samples obtained? And then, again, how many references do you want to use? Again, this depends. In the bad old days, we were encouraged to be obsessional and let no one go uncited. And it was just silly. Now, many journals don't let you have more than 20 citations for the whole paper. So if you're talking about, you'll use the following criteria for renal cell carcinoma, one reference is adequate. You don't need a whole bunch of them. They're just a couple pithy references. And you don't need to reference how hematocrit was measured. Took a CBC, period. If you're using a research assay for something, then you probably do need to reference that. So, what variables do you want to describe? Now, the paper, Dawn, that you had for 5 years, what was that about?
It was about quality of life in Parkinson's disease.
Okay. So you had to describe the quality of life variables that you used and what measures.
It was a self-report quality of life instrument that looked at different aspects of quality of life, like activities of living, affect.
And fortunately, I called on you because you're studying one of the few things that I still remember a little bit about. And I think the issue is, if you used a very common measure of quality of life, SF36 or whatever, you probably don't even have to go into it very much. You can simply say, I used this. On the other hand, if you used a German quality of life scale that we're not terribly familiar with, or you made up your own, you're probably going to need to add a couple items just to give the flavor of this. It's really a problem in patient-reported outcomes measurements if you don't understand what the scale is measuring. PROMIS, P-R-O-M-I-S. How many of you know what PROMIS is? Thanks. I just want to know, don't want to be going off. The rest of you take notice. PROMIS. Look it up. Promise.gov, isn't that probably going to?
I think so. It's on the website.
Yeah.
You just Google it.
Anything that you're going to be studying, ultimately is going to come down to patient-reported outcome measures information system. I think that's what the IS is. And one of the few decent things the government has done recently in the last 5 years has been PROMIS. It's an institute-wide effort to generate outcomes measurement for all of us. It's very user-friendly for researchers. If you're looking at radiation oncology and you're interested in quality of life and fatigue or pain or whatever it is, you just go to the promised site and look up pain, look up fatigue. And these are really the cutting edge patient self-report outcomes measurements that are around. And you should have an awfully good reason for not using those. Fine, just have a good reason not to use them.
Are you
Because,
saying it's a database of scale items? So
Yeah.
you get the questionnaire items?
Yeah.
Okay.
public domain, and many of them have item analysis, so they work with Bayesian statistical properties so that you don't have to fill out 15 items on a depression scale. If you say, if the item one, I'm making this up, if item one is, do you feel like killing yourself, and number two is, do you feel depressed, well, you're done. The computer has that one figured out. You don't need to go into early morning awakening and sleep disruption, etc. It's a marvelously useful site, and it also has valid translations into Spanish for most things. I'm not sure how extensive, anybody who's used Promise in any other language other than Spanish or English, I'm just not sure. Angela, did you?
Oh, no, I haven't.
Okay. Lauren, I think you said you've used it, right?
I don't think it has a wide array of translations. So I ended up using a different quality of life measure for our study. But I do some work with others who use that for similar research in English.
The translation is tricky.
Yeah, there's a whole science to validating translations of PRO instruments.
It's really tricky. The curious thing is, say we generate a fatigue scale, and for psychometrics we have 15 items that belong in fatigue and another 10 items in pain and all that, and we get how each item correlates with the others within each of these subscales. Well, the curious thing is that when you go in different languages, you start to observe different things. And it's not just a problem with pure translation. It's that the concepts mean something. It's really striking. For instance, in the fatigue scale, many of the items many of the inventories include an item like I feel pooped. Now you try to do that in Spanish. Poop? What's that have to do with fatigue? So anyway, you probably at some point will have a questionnaire that you're going to write, and you're going to translate it into Spanish in some ad hoc way, and you're going to be butchered on review if there is an accepted, valid translation already available. So look to see whether it's available and use it. If it's not, well, do the best you can. The translation, back translation, all of that, it's still somewhat iffy, particularly if you're focusing on cultural issues, whether you're really hitting it, the nail on the head. Data analysis. It's going to sound strange, but when we have the statistics section, you'll get a flavor for this. Particularly with higher order statistics, people care a great deal what your statistical program was. Now, you don't have to reference how you did a t-test. You can, I suppose, but if you're doing mixed models, God help you if you don't define it. And it turns out that some people have very strong feelings about whether you should use SPSS or not. And you just need to specify it and specify the version number, because it has happened that there are bugs in programs and they don't necessarily fix them. So if you use version 5, maybe it got fixed by the time you got to version 7, and you just like to know what you used for that. One of the mistakes that we all make is that we assume that the data exists in the database and it's accurate. Gosh.
Wouldn't that be nice?
There will be peace in the Middle East before all the data will exist in the database and before it's all accurate. It's really a treacherous assumption. And one of the things that actually writing a paper forces us to do is to look back and make sure that we have the data we think we have. If you've got a captive database from some that was acquired elsewhere, if you're working off a mentor's database, it's more like Swiss cheese. And the question is, how much cheese is there per hole? So are there big holes in the database or little? Is there 10% data missing? That's that's actually a good study. If it's 10% data that's missing, that's awfully impressive. When you get into some statistical approaches, however, that rely on all of the data, that starts to cause problems. So one of the things that people struggle with is, how do you deal with missing data? And your paper needs to talk about that. Who's been burned by missing data in your papers? Yes, tell us about it.
How I have been burned?
No, right next to you.
Dead or alive would be a variable that one would think would be pretty accurate in different copies of the same data set. But
You're absolutely right. There's a resurrection.
But you find out that you're working on the same data set as other people are, and one person reports 300 deaths, and your data set says there's only 250 deaths. That would be something that should be reconcilable at some basic level.
Vital statistics.
Vital
statistics.
So we went back to the NDI. I mean, we had to kind of work all the way back to the National Death Index stuff.
This is notorious. You'd think a simple dichotomy, coin flip, 1-0, dead, alive, male, female. Not so
that's
clear.
That's changed in some studies that we've worked on too. So.
And that can change. But I do work on ethnicity and health, amongst other things, and you'd be astonished about the number of vital statistic records where somebody has changed his race between birth and death. It's phenomenal. So there are lots of ways you can't assume that just because you've got a listing of the variables, that there's a valid data point in each one of those variables. You'd just be very disappointed doing a study in drug abuse, and you're looking at some intervention and how many people really completed the measures, how many people really completed the protocol, and are your data worth anything? When you give a questionnaire out, do your patients complete the questionnaire? Or do they get fatigued? Or could they just not give a darn and only fill out 5 of the items and return the rest to you blank? That's lethal for studies. So one of the things that I think you'll want to figure on doing is some way of maintaining the surveillance while you're doing the study to see that all the data is coming in and double checking it. Sometimes the way you design a data entry form contributes to data entry errors, so that if you're into database construction in electronic format, you want to look at that, and you'll want to see, given that we are a culpable species, is it 1 out of 100 keystrokes that we're going to mess up? That's not bad. So start looking and seeing whether the keystrokes are randomly appearing or whether they're appearing in one particular part. If it's one particular variable that tends to be miskeyed, then you need to think about whether the database form could be tweaked to make it more user-friendly for you. So, what about outliers? And tell me, I can't see your...
Tina Rifkin, sorry.
And so what's your area in?
I'm a nephrologist, and I do work in blood pressure and kidney disease in old people.
So have you found many outliers in your data?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you never know what to do with. There's numbers you never know what to do with. So you know that nobody weighed 2,000 pounds. They probably weighed 200 pounds, right? You mean, yeah, error-related things like that?
Outliers,
So
like
those are clear errors.
is a systolic blood pressure of
Right.
200?
Yes.
It's an outlier statistically, but what do you do with it? And do you believe it? This is the kind of stuff that you'll probably be wanting to discuss a little bit with your mentor, because it's one thing with an impossible value of a blood pressure of 2,000. That's pretty clear. But a blood pressure of 200, well, it's quite possible.
Right.
And then how are you going to deal with that statistically? Who else has been burned by outliers?
Tommy Gates.
And what's your area?
I'm looking at the geographic distribution of HIV and other STIs in sex workers in Tijuana, Mexico.
So what outliers have you seen?
I've actually had a recent mission I'm working on right now. One of the commenting reviewers was including a variable in my analysis, which when I reran the analysis, I realized that these individuals were influencing my results, and it was because these were individuals that were showing up twice in my data set. In other words, what I was looking at is the venues that they work in and how this relates to the distribution of HIV and STIs. And some of these women reported more than one venue.
More than
one venue.
Yeah.
And so I thought I had resolved the issue beforehand, and when I added this new variable to the analysis, I found out, well, how I thought I resolved it really didn't resolve the problem. And these women were outliers that were just changing the results. Not only the estimates, but the significance of my estimates. So now I'm trying to figure out what to do with them.
So you know, what we're talking about, on the face of it, we're talking about how to write a paper, but we're really talking about how to do the research and how to struggle with the data. One of the things that I've just done for years and years is I plot the distribution of every variable. Every variable in the study. And you know, it's very easy to pick off absolutely unbelievable things. And you start working in, but sometimes you get into this hazy ground where it's less certain. There are lots of ways people deal with outliers. Sometimes we got rid of the things that nobody in their right mind would accept. That's one way. But that really doesn't go very far. So sometimes people will say, we trimmed the data and eliminated any anybody who is more than 3 standard deviations from the mean. People will quibble, but at least they know what you did. There are lots of things like that that you're going to want to put in the paper. So, moving on to page 5. So how many tables and figures do you want to have? And again, this is in different areas. So, Tommy, you write in public health.
Yes.
The journals that you want to write in, to be published in, what's their view? They tend to be table-oriented more than figure-oriented.
Yes, to a certain extent. So I just finished a paper that was a longitudinal analysis, and I thought the best way to present the results, which I've seen commonly done with these, is with figures. So I think it depends on your analysis. If it's cross-sectional, then definitely tables are preferred.
And the question then is how many? And this is all so idiosyncratic for each journal. I think one of the problems is that you lose sight of the fact that aesthetics are important. When you submit the paper, don't send it in with some ugly looking figure. Don't send it in with an SPSS figure or an SPSS table. They're hideous. And you want somebody to really be able to look at it. You want it to be nice enough so that your twin sister would say, gee, I want to steal that and work it in my PowerPoint lecture. So do try to work in some sense of pride in the formatting of the figure. And again, it's so easy to do these figures now with computer graphics that it's you should be able to make considerable progress on that. So, in the results, most of the time, you're going to start off with something that says, Figure 1 summarizes the enrollment characteristics. And then you're going to describe the steps. So I pasted in, there are any number of these, I pasted in at the end of the notes on page 11, we've got a consort flow diagram. You can snatch these off journal sites, adapt them. This is what you want to have. If you're tracking people, you need to be able to account for that. And again, preferably something that looks halfway decent. You can do them yourself, but they might not look quite as good. The next thing that you'll probably get to in the results is the patient characteristics. So table X describes the patient characteristics. And you know, you're going to find out that there are missing data despite our concerns we talked about in the methods section. So you simply say, sample size varies in the subsequent analyses because of occasional missing data. In general, no more than 10% of the data points were missing for any one variable. You'll probably want to say the values were or were not normally distributed. And thus we did or didn't do a log transform. And when we plot this on the figure, we are either showing the log transformed because for those of you who are clinicians who don't think in terms of logs, we're showing the non-transformed values. This is it'll just happen. Then I guess the issue is, what do you want to put into the results section? Who's doing basic research? Okay, okay. So, what sorts of things would you want to put in as a key finding to start out in results? Okay. How would you structure it? And what paper are you working on right now?
Well, I just finished one. So what are you asking me? How would I structure the data that we have?
How would you structure the results section in this paper? And why don't you tell the group roughly what the paper's about?
The paper is about neutrophils and a particular way that they have to kill bacteria, and then the mechanisms that trigger this way of killing bacteria.
Okay. One of the things that people struggle with is how much do you recapitulate in the text of the results what's in the table itself. So you might have a table of 57 ways that neutrophils do in bacteria, or 57 bacteria that are or are not affected in this one pathway. It would be really boring to just recap that entire thing all over in the results section, and most of us just pick a couple of areas that we really want to emphasize in the text of the results section, and a couple areas of pertinent negatives, the kind of Sherlock Holmes thing, the dog that didn't bark, the variable that was not, interestingly, affected. The results section frequently is where we struggle with the first person when we write. And I don't know the answer to this. I don't think it's a sin to use the first person in a paper once or twice. It's risky a little bit to do it more than once or twice, but certainly once or twice in a paper is fine. So, you know, table 1 looks at this the association of A and B controlling for covariates C and D. Next, we did the following step. You can do that, and it just helps in readability. At this point, I think you should start thinking about your preferred journal's style. I wouldn't get hung up on it right now. And be thinking a little bit about the ideal number of tables and figures. And at that point, you should stop. You have done the methods and results section. You need to send it to your mentor at least 3 days in advance. Don't do it the night before. 3 days in advance. Schedule a meeting and send all of this to the mentor. Now, one of the things that does come up in papers is I guess the conservation of data. It used to be easy in small studies. You had a lab notebook, you'd do an HPLC run in the lab, and you'd save your little scrolls and all that, and you looked at 14 people, and then you did a little worksheet all by hand, and you saved that in a folder. Thank goodness we don't have to do that anymore. But now we have developed a faith in the constancy of a database. So when you do a study, where do you store your data? If you're writing it up, you're writing up the paper, you're about to submit it, where do you store the data?
In my computer, I mean my. Well, usually I do have like a backups. I mean, I do have regular backups of the computer.
Regular? You're one of the few people who regularly back up your
Internet, you can work on it. And then when you get into the internet, it kind of synchronizes.
Cool.
And then if you have a collaborator, you can always share it.
You're less likely to have a painful few weeks when you've lost all your data, but it still is a problem. How many of you would rely on the CTRI information services? The CRC days, the server was in Hillcrest, and the guys from facilities maintenance were doing some work on the fire system, the fire retardant system. So the first problem was that the maintenance guy used the computer as a footstool. And the second problem was that he slipped when he was working on the fire stuff. And so whatever data hadn't been crushed by his heavy feet was then flooded. I would say that even if you're using the supercomputer on campus, you're taking an enormous risk if you store your data that way and that way alone. Some redundancy, honestly, it will bring you some comfort. How many of you have had hard drives fail? You're lucky. You have.
I would have been an engineer. That's my stuff.
And just don't assume that your institution's computer is necessarily maintained in the right way. And, you know, acts of God occur even if it is maintained in the right way. So you probably want some redundancy. And one of the issues is that you may need access to your data 10 years from now. Not so much out of somebody saying, gee, you did it the wrong way and I proved that you have to redo it this way. And that usually, that kind of problem is within the first year. But instead, you'll get a letter out of the blue or an email out of the blue from somebody who says, gee, I saw your paper, I'm doing a meta-analysis in this area, and I couldn't figure out from your data what the distribution was, and I'd be ever so grateful. Now, you have your own choice about whether you want to help that person or not, but if you really do want to help them, it helps to have the data. And most data is a living document, so that it's really rare that somebody says, I'm going to get exactly this many sols in the paper, and I'm going to do all the assays, I'm going to get everything neatened up, and then I'm going to write. That's actually rare. More often, people will start working on this piece, and then that piece, and then that piece, and just because this final one may not compare at all to an earlier set of data. So one of the things that you might want to do is to save a worksheet in your Pendaflex folder and label it carefully. I'm struggling with this right now as we go switching servers, and it's driving me nuts about trying to remember what I called something 30 years ago and trying to retrieve it. Now, 30 years, what's the likelihood that something terribly urgent or is going to be a problem? Time goes on, and you probably, in addition to that folder where you save the reviewers' benighted comments about your treasured paper, you should save all the data for that backed up that analysis, because you might want to go back to that. And you're not going to remember. Maybe starting out, if this is your N+1 paper, you'll remember it, but pretty soon, you've written so many papers that it's very, very difficult.
Do you also recommend saving the drafts of the paper you work on, because there could be many, many versions?
Oh, only if you really want to have fun someday showing people how much work goes into it. I don't. Sometimes I've found that I've written a paper that I loved, and the reviewers said, well, Joel, fine, but cut it in half. And maybe I'll save that earlier draft because it had good stuff in it. But most of the time when I don't bother saving drafts. Yes?
What are your thoughts about the data management issue in the eyes of the IRB, which is in terms of where you store your data and how you back it up? I mean, there are limitations in terms of what you suggest. For instance, I had data from my prior institution that I just destroyed because I wasn't allowed to have it here. Now, the people who have it back at the other institutions still have it, but I don't have access to it. At the VA, I'm not even allowed to store my data on another device. I mean, I've said that I don't.
You said the right thing. So I think part of this has to do with what is the term, the patient identifier characteristics, these sorts of things, the name, the social security number, the medical record number.
But you can date of birth, and there's lots.
Yeah. I think if the data has been purged of those identifiable characteristics, I haven't seen problems with the IRBs, but it just may be at the level of paranoia of various institutions.
Yeah.
Are you getting different advice?
I think from the VA, for sure, you're not supposed to have that data in any form on a computer other than the VA, and you're not supposed to, maybe I see other people nodding, you're not supposed to store it. So it's just hard to know how to best safeguard your data outside of what they allow you to do to safeguard your...
So what's your workaround within the limits of the VA rules? Have you found something that you're comfortable with and that the VA is comfortable with?
I can create data sets that are totally de-identified, that have no birth dates, and
Okay.
I take out race, I take out everything except the analytical variables. But I'm still not sure that that's an acceptable work.
Another thing is that maybe you have the computer in your office and you've got another computer in your division's office, and they're a floor apart. And the odds of the entire VA going up in flames are kind of low. The odds of 2 floors getting flooded, well, of course that happened at BSB. It happens everywhere. It's a level of how much can you prepare for. I think, in a way, what I'm talking about, there are two issues. Are you doing some perfunctory backing up remotely or automatically? And secondly, are you reaching out to yourself 20 years from now and saying, this is how this data is constructed, this is the name of the file, this is the worksheet? You better do that. It's really important to do that. And I don't, one of the things I've struggled with is this, once you've de-identified stuff, well, you're sunk in a way. If you've obtained further, it's an issue.
You can't do an NDI lookup without, I mean, you can't look in the National Death Index unless you have the person's identifying information.
Anybody else have experiences with this? About
Sometimes you can store under, lock and key some, you make a surrogate patient identifier that has no meaning on it. And then you have some sort of link stored that maybe only you have access to. You still have to, there's no getting around the IRB. You have to still explain what you're doing.
again, I think that the real problem. Now Jose's not going to have this problem because he's backing up. The most likely source of grief is your computer died and you didn't have any backup. That will happen. There are only two categories of people in the world, those whose hard drives have crashed and those whose hard drives haven't yet crashed. So it will happen. These other de-identifying things are, it's tricky. It's tricky. Angela, have you had any issues like this with data?
I just started doing some work with this sort of thing, and I'm trying to figure that out currently, right now. So, but I think it's similar kinds of issues, like how do you do it? But I've also heard of what he said, using a different identifier system, that you have a separate file that assigns, subject IDs, a different number that a numbering scheme that you come up with, and then you keep that locked.
It's interesting in that NSF now is already requiring something like this in grant applications for how will you safeguard the data and make it available. And curiously, the library is getting interested in this. So the library is developing archival ways of storing data, and I think it will be an interesting competition, if you will, between the Supercomputer Center, CTRI Data Management, and Library Archival. They're all going to be putting some joint work together into this, and it's going to be interesting to sort this out. So, okay, you met with a mentor. Step 2 on page 8. Let's assume you've already met with a mentor. Mind you, this approach will take you 1 month. Assuming you did the study, you more or less had all the analyses agreed on, and you've got a mentor who's willing to meet with you regularly, you should be able to write a paper in 1 month. A very creditable paper. So, step 2, write the abstract and the introduction. Revise the methods, results, figures, and tables based on the mentor's comments. The abstract, structured abstract is straightforward. The keywords sometimes aren't straightforward, and that's a term of art. And I think Tony DeMaria talked a little bit about this at our last session. Those keywords are really important because many of the journal software programs are going to pick the reviewers based on the keywords that you assign. The introduction, begin working on the introduction. Do you all use Ref Manager or some EndNote? Anybody not use that yet? Okay. I'm not sure one is any one better than another? Google has one as well. What's your favorite way of organizing reference citations?
I just use EndNote, yeah. I don't have another reference.
The library has really easy, free training courses in EndNote. If you haven't done that, it's very, very accessible. So structuring an introduction is more difficult, and this in a way is kind of similar to the issue about a review and how do you structure a review. I usually hope that paragraph 1 is going to say, why is this an interesting topic? And then some paragraph 2 through X is going to be something about the relevant literature. And I included in the very end of this handout on page 16 a dummied up table 1. It's, again, people generally like tables and figures. So if you're going to talk about what's known about your particular area, have some kind of summary table. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be exhaustive. You could label it representative summary, if you wish. But some way of conveying to somebody the disarray of the field. It helps to set up your paper as context and where it fits in. The final paragraph is also structured. The final paragraph really says, for this reason, this paper examined X. People are expecting that. If you just look at your own behavior when you read a paper, you scan a journal, maybe you're not so interested that you're really you want to figure out what they're studying. And the abstract doesn't necessarily set it up, but that final paragraph really should restate the hypotheses. So again, just this amount of work, you've marinated, you've gone through 2 weeks, 2 steps, you're going to get same thing, send everything incrementally to your mentor and make an appointment to go over it.
What about summarizing with a couple of sentences the results in the final paragraph?
The results in the introduction?
Yeah, like 2 sentences saying, we decided to study this and we found blah, blah, blah.
That would be unusual. Again, I don't know. There are lots of ways. That's usually an unusual, most places would find that unusual. People aren't looking for it there. I can see it coming up. Sometimes that happens in the methods section. That we did this, but because we saw this weird thing, we then added on an extra analysis. Sometimes I've seen that kind of thinking portrayed in a methods. I haven't seen it. Anybody seen that in results creeping into the introduction?
Sometimes, like, if I cross over and try to read a basic science paper.
I'm sorry?
The rat studies and those studies, I find that, and I don't understand why they do it, but.
It's usually at the end of the abstract, so you have this paper shows what your conclusion is. It's usually not in the body of an introduction. I'm actually guilty of doing that, and the reason I do it is because I think if you just summarize your main points of finding in a very precise, ambiguous way, you actually entice the readers to want to read more. Basically, you're providing a context as to why you're doing the study, and a very brief summary point of what you did find And then the discussion will be the place where you really just discuss and compare your results and how it fits in the context of the literature. So it sort of is like a teaser, in my opinion.
What kind of journals are you guys publishing?
Well,
Sounds disciplinary.
perhaps.
Genetics, or.
Now, you're both in genetics, so
Yeah.
it may be a way that things are done in your area. It's a little unusual. Lauren, you're smiling.
Oh, I totally concur. I think the way that basic science articles are written and organized baffles me, but or they put the methods at the end in like a tiny little appendix, little small font.
Well, the order of things sometimes is dependent on the journal too. Because some, like science, there's no method sections like in the supplementary. It's in the online thing, so it's not even in the.
Yeah, because usually when I read an article, that's the first thing I jump to is, oh, what are their methods? So I want to know how they designed their study. And then you're like, yeah, and you read a science paper.
And increasingly, that's online, and you have to look for that elsewhere. But so we're getting a sense that, in fact, the different disciplines do organize papers a little differently. I think it's unusual. Obviously, it's done. If you're aspiring to publish something in one journal, if that's your favorite journal and you've seen some of your favorite authors writing a paper that way, well, that sounds okay. If you can't find anybody who does it that way, maybe you don't want to do it. So, step 3, again, you've done the introduction, you've done everything. Now that's the toughie about the discussion. And I don't know, this really is, I think, difficult. People just don't know what to say. So I've put down some thoughts about how you might structure it. What have been your experiences? Bernd, what about when you've done a discussion? How do you organize it?
I was a basic science person, so usually our first paragraph is just summarized again.
Restate
Restate.
Yep.
And then essentially you just bring everything into the context, like you said, with the literature and current concepts. What's different? And then your third point is a very tricky one, in my opinion. When I started writing my first papers, I pointed out every negative thing about this study, and then every reviewer jumped on this and wanted to have more to prove that this is not the case. So I'm going a little bit a step back and saying, I have limitations, but I don't point them out so very obvious to the reviewers. Again, these are not clinical studies, and these are basic sciences a little bit different, I think, from clinical limitations. Like if you have a randomized controlled, placebo-controlled trial, obviously you did a very good job, but if you don't have that, everybody recognizes, okay, you didn't use placebo-controlled patients.
So just how many limitations are you supposed to list? 3, 7, 83?
Like half.
I mean, if the limitations section, if you kind of go into a trance and the limitation says, of course this study is limited because of the sample size and the ethnic distribution, and this was done in Southern California. I mean, what have we really learned there? Show me a study that isn't better by doubling the sample size. So maybe it's important to say that sometimes. But what are the limitations? I mean, in your heart of hearts, what do you wish you had done differently? Or if you'd gotten the $1 million grant to do this study differently, how would you have designed it differently? Now, there's some journals that really want you to go into this Rousseau confession of everything that you didn't do, but what are the main points that are limitations? So, conclusion, that's simple. So some journals don't even let you write a conclusion. But it's a short section. And at that point, when you've really embodied the whole paper, you should discuss with the mentor authorship. Because you don't want to get in one of those pissy conflicts about who's first author, who's second. And we talked about that at our last session. This is what editors don't want to hear about this. This is, they want you to resolve that. So start getting some input from the mentor about the likely people to include as authors. And honestly, it's all across the board. There are people who make a case for it should be anybody who touched the paper at all to people who were just absolutely crucially involved. And you can make that case, but it's also appropriate at that point to discuss journals where the mentor thinks is likely to be received well. It's nice to aspire to a leading journal. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to get paper in a leading journal. Time is passing, and you have to, maybe you think that this paper is better than sliced bread. Maybe it's just good. Are you wasting time sending it to science? Probably. Are you wasting time sending it to New England Journal? Probably. Are you wasting time sending it to Archives of General Psychiatry? Probably. There are lots and lots of journals, but you need the input of the mentor to get a sense of that. And also begin talking with the mentor about reviewers and who you want, who the mentor's known enemies are. You're too young to have enemies. When you're old, you will have enemies whether you deserve them or not. And so, who to request not be a reviewer if the mentor has some thoughts about that. And at that point, you're going to send the paper out to the co-authors. And this is going to be disheartening because they're going to be deadbeats. They're just going to, you're going to sit and wait. They're going to take it on their trip to Washington and leave it in a hotel room and forget about it. They're not even going to download it. You've got to get it to them. And by getting it to them at this point, you're in the meantime, you're still working on the paper, but try to give them a polite drop-dead deadline. I'd really love to hear from you within the next 2 weeks. If I don't hear from you, I assume that you're fine with this. In your own way. And also ask them simultaneously for their thoughts about journal venues and possible reviewers. So while you're waiting for their feedback, you're still thinking, you're looking at the information for authors to look at the kind of slightly quirky way that your journal likes to see things. You're going to work on the acknowledgments. You're going to ask the co-authors, what grants do you want cited, and send me the numbers. Get to them all in one document. Work on the consort checklist. And again, I just pasted in a consort checklist in there. It probably also makes sense to get from the co-authors their conflict of interest statements. get all of this at once. So when you send it and ask for the 2-week turnaround, simultaneously ask for journal reviewers, conflict of interest sorts of things. There are some journals that are really miserably picky. They won't send out your journal unless every single co-author has finished every conflict of interest thing. Most journals will, you can say, I've got it and I'm sending them in. Some journals just really aren't going to even review it until it's all in. So the sooner you get this cooking, the better. So let's summarize. Really, in 4 weeks, once you've done the work, you've checked the records, you've preserved the data, you've had a mentor that you've met with regularly, you can write a paper, good paper, in 4 steps. And one of the ways that this works is that you're constantly working on it in the back of your mind, but you're starting with the easier parts of the paper and you're building a sense of confidence. It's really rugged, starting with the introduction. It's really tough. So give yourself a sense of being able to make progress, to know that you're making progress, and even when you write the methods and results,